Hello and welcome back to the Walk and Talk. I hope you've had a fabulous week. I hope October's treating you guys well so far. Have you embraced the spooky season yet? This is very much one of my favourite times of the year because I live in a really old Victorian house that is very quirky and it lends itself perfectly to being the only witch in the village's house. When Halloween rolls around, I have tombstones that go out in the front garden. I make little pumpkin cookies for the kiddos. Truly, I love Halloween. Anyway, we're not here to talk about Halloween. We're very much here to talk about dogs. So let's crack on with it. Okay, so today's episode is pretty much inspired by my next door neighbour and their darling Dachshund, who I've never had the privilege of actually meeting in person, but my God, do I feel like that dog is a massive part of my life because today I want to talk about garden behaviour, what your dogs are doing in the garden, how you are managing or utilising their time in the garden, or whether the stuff they do out there is actually driving you wild, and exactly what you can do about that. Because our gardens can be a real blessing, can't they? When it comes to owning a dog, it's instant access to outdoor time. It's a space to exercise. It's an easy way to get your dog house trained. But they can also be the stage for some of the trickiest, most frustrating behaviours as well. Barking at the fence, digging up the flower beds, ignoring you when it's time to come in, charging at the postman, fence running with the neighbour's dog, becoming obsessive, reactive, hypervigilant, all of that stuff. I could go on, right? And if any of this sounds familiar to you, then please keep listening because in this episode, I want to really take you deep into the why and the how behind all of this, why these problems arise in the garden, why dogs often react more strongly there than anywhere else, what good and bad habits can form, and how to actually manage your dog's garden time. And then, because I never like to just leave you with problems, we're going to get into all the positive and useful ways you can turn this around. So, how to use your garden to enrich your dog's life, to train good behaviours rather than facilitate bad habits, and to build their fitness too, if that's what you're into. And of course, I will do my best to weave in a little bit of the neuroscience too, the behavioural principles, the clever little pieces of knowledge that are hopefully going to help you see your dog with fresh eyes and think, oh, okay, that makes so much sense now. I get it. I know what to do. So let's get stuck in and start with why the garden is such a unique environment for our dogs. For us, it's just part of the house, really, isn't it? By extension, it's where we hang the washing, we sit with a cup of tea. When it's sunny, maybe you plant a few flowers so it looks nice. But for a dog, the garden is this fascinating, in-betweeny kind of world. It's not quite indoors with those rules, and it's not quite out there in the big wide world either. And that makes it behaviourally really interesting because in that halfway zone, dogs are exposed to all sorts of things, aren't they? There's other dogs barking that they can hear, people passing by, birds, maybe traffic noises, the postman, squirrels. But at the same time, they feel like this is their space, their patch, it's their territory. And that combination, the outside world being so present and yet it being theirs at the same time, is why the garden is often where reactivity gets rehearsed the most. So imagine this, your dog hears the postman or just someone walking past the front of the house from inside the house. Maybe they'll bark once or twice. But in the garden, there are no walls muffling the sound. The scent is stronger on the breeze. They feel physically closer to this intruder in their eyes, so their reaction is bigger. It's more intense. And so maybe multiple times a day or a week, your dog is rehearsing that charge to the gate or running straight up to the fence and that big vocal outburst. And the problem is, every time they rehearse that, their brain is literally laying down a stronger neural pathway for that behavior choice, which basically means it's becoming a habit. And this is something I really want you to take away, right? Dogs don't just display behaviors and behavior choices at random. They practice them, and each rep is a rehearsal, and every one of those repetitions strengthens that wiring in the brain that makes that behavior more likely to happen again. So what happens in the garden over time doesn't just stay in the garden. If your dog is rehearsing reactivity there, it will absolutely eventually bleed into your walks and maybe other situations. So let's talk about why these problems arise in the first place. The first big one is basically supervision or the lack of it, because so often owners see the garden as a safe space, which of course in many ways it is. But that means the dog is just left out there unsupervised. And without guidance, dogs create their own entertainment, or their own work is probably a better word for it. And very often that work is barking at people, digging, maybe pacing the fence, patrolling, all the things that we don't really want, and yet we allow them to practice. When the problem is, those behaviors are actually self-rewarding. Now, this is the first really big problem for owners, because the foundation of all animal behavior is essentially that reinforcement drives behavior. This is how we can teach an animal to do things, right? We take a behavior choice that the animal makes, like sit when I say sit, and we make it reinforcing. So we feed them some cheese. And therefore, the behavior choice, sit when the human says sit, just becomes more likely to happen again. The behavior is driven by the reinforcement. Now, that's great when we can control the reinforcement, isn't it? I hold the cheese, so I will decide what reinforces you and what doesn't. But if the reinforcement is intrinsic to the dog, if the barking or the fence running or the digging is simply intrinsically reinforcing because it just scratches a biological itch, it just fulfills a species motivated drive within the dog, then if we let our dogs practice that behavior, they've just learned how to earn that reinforcement over and over again that we cannot control at all. And so they repeat the behavior, and with every repetition, the likelihood that they'll choose that behavior next time increases. And before you know it, you have a dog who now, as soon as the back door opens, bolts outside and starts barking straight away, because that is now a self-reinforced habit, because we didn't get involved early enough in preventing them from accessing that self-reinforcement. Okay, I hope that makes sense. The second reason is simply the sheer number of triggers. Let's be real. The garden is buzzing with sensory stimulation. There's birds flying over, there's cats slipping through the fence, there's hedgehogs shuffling about at night, rats, foxes, delivery vans, kids playing football, the neighbour's dog. It's basically Disneyland for the canine senses. And all of this is happening right at the boundary line of what the dog sees as theirs. And that territorial piece is huge. Then you've got the associations. If every single time your dog steps into the garden, they are barking, they're running the fence, they're getting hyped up, then the very act of walking out of the back door, or the back door opening, or even the human reaching for the back door, like I already mentioned, eventually just becomes a cue to get aroused. The garden itself becomes a trigger. And dogs learn this incredibly fast, especially when emotions are involved and they start to anticipate. I'm outside now, or I'm about to go outside, so I need to be on guard. Number one, that's what I always do. And number two, I feel purposeful doing it. And finally, there's the thing that is actually a factor in 99% of behavioral problems in dogs, and that's just inconsistency. Owners sometimes allow the dog to rehearse behaviors, but then the moment it tips over into whatever that owner perceives as being too much, they get cross, or they try to punish the barking after the fact. The problem with that is dogs don't connect the dots the way we do. They don't think, oh, she's really angry now that I've come in because I was out there barking. They just think, that scary dog next door appeared. I felt stressed, and then she shouted, and she got stressed. So, yeah, I guess that dog next door is definitely scary. He's scared all of us. And then you've accidentally just reinforced that negative association with the dog next door. So, on the flip side of all that, what does it look like when garden habits are actually healthy versus all of this unhealthy stuff we can accidentally allow them to practice? Well, the good habits are obviously when your dog goes out, they just go to the toilet pretty promptly. Maybe they have a little sniff around, maybe they engage with a bit of play with you, they check back in when you call them, and then they happily just come inside. It's calm, it is connected, it's balanced. Do my dogs do this in the garden? Absolutely, they do. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll probably have seen, because I post a lot of this, especially in the summer, videos of the next door neighbour's dog, bless him, barking his little backside off through the fence. And my dog's just coming and laying on a mat or playing a game with me or whatever. They're certainly not responding to him barking. But to be real, do you know why they do that? Albie especially. It is because from absolutely day dot of his life and his experience living here with me, I never, ever, ever, ever just kicked open the back door and sent him out there to do his thing. I've never done that. I always went with him. From when he was, a new puppy onwards, I always gave him a directive like, okay, we're here to toilet, we're here to train, we're here to play. And I never let him get a chance to explore any potential bad habits. So now he just doesn't really have any out there. He's nearly 2. I might let him go out there on his own now if I've just like set something up for him, like if I've checked his breakfast out there for scatter feeding or something like that. I might just leave him out there to his devices because I know what he's going to do. But generally, garden trips are still something we'll do together because I never want him to respond and bark at the neighbour's dog and then feel reinforced by that. So when the next door neighbour's dog barks, he has actually learned to run over to me because I've made absolutely sure with the use of food or a toy or whatever that I've always, always made that choice reinforcing from the very beginning. It really does all go back to the simple rule of behaviour, right? What gets reinforced gets repeated, and what gets repeated becomes habit. Now, the less helpful habits that I know are a reality for the majority of dog owners are when the dog races out, they charge for the boundary, scanning, barking at everything, pacing, digging, chewing your garden furniture, ignoring you completely when it's time to come in, maybe even playing stay away completely, or just spending the whole time out there in a state of hypervigilance. And I always want to stress, your dog isn't being naughty when they're doing all of these things. These are just behaviors that have been allowed to develop because they're rewarding in and of themselves. Digging just feels great. Barking makes the scary person or the scary dog move away. Fence running floods the body with adrenaline. It feels powerful. It delivers a reward. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. They are rewarded anyway. So if you want to change those habits, it's not about telling your dog off for doing them. It's about replacing them with things that are equally rewarding or more rewarding, but much healthier and more sustainable. So, with that in mind, let's move on to managing garden time. And one of my golden rules is this: the garden is part of your training environment. It is absolutely not just a free for all. And that means being intentional, especially with young dogs. I really, really would encourage you not to just fling the back door open and let them zoom about for half an hour unsupervised. Go out with them, guide them, give them things to do. Maybe you scatter some food in the grass for them to sniff out. Maybe you had a toy. Maybe you practice a couple of recalls or reward a nice bit of calm sitting by your feet. Supervise, shape, and reward the things you want to see more of. And if you're in a position where you're thinking, okay, that's all well and good if we're starting from the beginning with a puppy, but I already have this 3-year-old dog and he already has these bad habits. What do I do? You just need to find a way to interrupt those bad habits. So if your dog now, he's twitching away at the back door, and as soon as it's flung open, he flies out there like a rocket and he starts barking, you're gonna purposefully change that behavior, right? Put him on a lead. For the next couple of weeks or 10 days or however long it takes, we're going to interrupt that behavior choice because he's on a lead. So that will instantly kind of shift his mindset because you've changed the picture for him. He's like, oh, well, I don't normally go out in the garden like this. The lead normally means something else. So I'm not really sure what's happening here. And he can't run and he can't charge the fence because he's on a lead. You're going to be in charge. You're going to guide him around. And with repetition, you have broken that habit and introduced a new habit. And over time, as your dog develops these really solid habits in the garden, you can afford to give them a bit more structured freedom out there. For example, you could set a training goal that your dog can go free in the garden, but they must respond every time they're called back to the house. How do you do that? So you need to deliver a reinforcer that outcompetes whatever the garden offers. In my house, my dogs still get a reward, and Nova is 12 years old, but they still get a reward every time I call them in from the garden. And they respond to being called in from the garden 100% of the time, because responding to that has always been more rewarding than not responding. Now, sometimes that might look like calling your dog in because you've just seen them digging up your flower bed. And you know what so many people do in this situation, right? They call their dog in because they're livid, they're digging up the flowers they just planted. The dog responds and they recall straight back. Amazing. And then they come into the house and the owner shouts at the dog. They're really cross. They grab them by the collar. They lug them into the kitchen, shut them in there and leave them because they're really annoyed and cross about the flower bed. No reward, of course, because they're livid. So you know what that dog has just learned in that situation? Bloody hell. Like, responding to that, when she called me in, responding to that was an absolute waste of my time. In fact, it was quite horrible, actually. I won't do that again. I won't do that next time because I was having an amazing time out there. So I'll just stay out there. So, anyway, ultimately, if you are struggling with problem behaviors, step one is always to reduce that unsupervised practice of them, because every repetition is strengthening the wiring in the brain, and we want to stop that rehearsal in its tracks. Now, moving on from those habits, when it comes specifically to triggers, why do dogs often react so much more strongly in the garden than they do elsewhere? Well, like I said before, this is partly about territory, right? So on a walk, your dog is in neutral territory, they're a visitor. So yes, they may still react to another dog, but the emotional tone is different. In the garden, that other dog or that delivery van or whatever is not just a neutral thing. It's a thing encroaching on my space. And that perceived intrusion creates a much more intense response. Because when animals perceive a threat on their own territory, the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, if you like, I call it Captain Panic because I'm a child, it fires much more strongly. Adrenaline spikes faster, cortisol levels rise more quickly. And the really important part here is that when this happens repeatedly, day in, day out, the brain begins to wire itself to expect it. And the result is that the dog's threshold for reacting in that way just gets lower and lower. And that's why some dogs go from just being a bit barky in the garden to being completely hypervigilant the second the door opens. It's been rehearsed so many times, and the brain has rewired itself around that expectation. And this is why I'm always saying more exposure is not the answer. Better quality exposure is the answer. Your dog doesn't need to be just left in the garden to get used to all of these triggering things. They need structured experiences that build calmness and grow their confidence. So, what can we do in the garden that's actually positive? Well, I love the garden as a place for recall practice. It's low stakes, it's enclosed, you know it's safe. You can build that really fun, really high value association with coming back to you. I also love scent games out there, scattering food in the grass. I do this a lot for my dogs. You can set up a little scavenger hunt, hiding treats around in plant pots and along fences, hiding things in cardboard boxes. Scent work is one of the most enriching things you can do with your dog. If you haven't listened to my podcast episode on scent work, go and listen to that. It's got a whole Kickstarter guide that comes with it that you can download from the show notes if you are interested in exploring that more. And the garden is the perfect setting for it. I also like using the garden for little agility style challenges, right? You don't need loads of fancy kit. You can just use whatever you've got. Garden chairs to weave around, pop some broom handles up on some flower pots for a little cavaletti, a little low wall or ornament or something for them to put their paws up on. It builds body awareness. It helps with balance and coordination and confidence. And of course, obviously, you can practice tricks, hand touches, eye contact, mat settles. I do a lot of that in the garden in the summer. All the fun little engagement games that make your dog look at you and just think, you're more interesting than anything else out here. I think I'm going to give my attention to you. And if that as a concept excites you, by the way, please check out my 21-day engagement training course. It's a perfect fit for this kind of training. So many of the games in that course are ideal to play in your garden. I think some of the video lessons you'll see, I have filmed some of the tutorials in my garden. They're fun, they're powerful, they completely transform the way your dog relates to you. Because instead of the garden being this space where they just practice all these bad habits, it becomes the space where you both practice connection. So I will pop the link for that in the show notes if you fancy joining that or checking it out. It really does change the dynamic. It's probably worth giving a couple of minutes to fitness as well, because your garden can be brilliant for that too. So it's really important to remember that you don't need endless miles of walking to build a fit dog. What you actually need is variety. Short bursts of games like tug are fantastic as long as you've got some nice clear, rules and boundaries around it. Hill sprints are great if you've got even a little incline in your garden. Cavaletti poles, I've already mentioned, literally just broomsticks on plant pots, or you can actually just get them these days, can't you, quite cheaply on Amazon or Pets at Home. Like I already mentioned, these are brilliant for coordination and strength. And here's a tip that a lot of people overlook, which I really like. You can create a digging pit or get a sandbox that is solely for your dog. Honestly, if you have one of those breeds like Dachshunds that loves to dig, don't fight it. Just channel it. Give them a designated area, maybe a sand pit from like a toy shop or maybe just a box of soil. Hide some toys or chews in there, and suddenly that urge to dig is being met in a really constructive, positive way for both of you. So that's plenty of ideas on what to do. Let's dive into what not to do for a quick sec, okay? Hopefully it's become obvious by now. Don't leave your dog outside to rehearse problem behaviours over and over again. But also, don't just punish barking. Don't just let it happen and then punish it, because the likelihood is it's just going to increase anxiety and make that stressful association worse. And despite what I've just said about fitness, don't think that garden time is a full substitute for walks. It isn't. Even the biggest garden doesn't really replicate the sensory variety and experience of a proper dog walk. That's not to say, by the way, that taking a break from walks can't be helpful in some behavioral scenarios. It absolutely can. But that's another big topic, so probably one for another episode, okay? And finally, don't just use the garden as a toilet stop. That's really boring. If that's all your dog ever does out there, you're missing a huge, huge opportunity for enrichment and training, in my opinion. So, closing thoughts. Basically, if we pull all this together, the garden really can go either way for you. It can be a place where your dog practices all the habits you don't want, like barking, reactivity, hypervigilance, or it can be the best training classroom, playground, enrichment zone, all the good stuff that you could ever ask for. The difference comes down to intention, your intention ultimately. If you treat the garden as part of your training environment, you will get a dog who knows how to be calm, how to be responsive, and how to stay connected to you out there. If you just leave it up to them, you'll probably end up with oodles of rehearsed frustration. So, my little challenge for you this week, if you're game, is this. I want you to spend just 10 minutes a day in the garden with your dog. Guide them, play with them, reward calmness, maybe do a bit of training. Just have some fun, play some games. Notice how different their mood feels afterwards. And you might be really surprised by just how powerful that simple little shift is from, making the garden just a free for all that they do out there by themselves to turning it into something that you do together. And if you would love more ideas on this, definitely have a look at my 21-day engagement training program. I designed it to give you little bite-sized games. You get one a day, and training exercises that you can get stuck into anywhere. But honestly, the garden is truly one of my favorite places to do it. Otherwise, I think that's it for today's Walk and Talk episode. I really hope you've enjoyed this little deep dive into garden behaviour. I hope you found it helpful and there's been one or two useful little actions that you can take away and get to work with that will hopefully make your garden a happier and calmer place for you and your dog if this is something that you are struggling with. Feel free, please, to share it with a friend who you think might find it useful. Feel free to send it to my next door neighbor if you want to. And if you feel so inclined to leave a review, if you did enjoy this episode, I would be so very grateful. It takes just a few seconds. It's completely free. You don't even have to log in. It's not complicated, but it makes such a big difference to me and to the podcast showing up for more people who need it. In the meantime, I will leave you to enjoy the rest of your walk, and I will see you same time next week for another episode of The Walk and Talk.